Okay, so hello everybody, or good morning to the US. Thank you for joining and welcome to this DCOM lecture of today. It's on freedom of expression in the digital public sphere, and in essence it's about online content moderation, which is a hot topic of today, as we have seen in the past weeks. I'm especially happy to welcome Sunimal Mendis from Tilburg University as a speaker. And today we have a new format. I also welcome Christiane Wendehorst from the University of Vienna as a respondent. And the moderation is done by Erich. And I also would like to thank Erich since he has organized this discussion as well. Before introducing Erich and who will then introduce Sunimal and Christiane, some short words to our digital humanism initiative. Sometimes I have this tendency to repeat things, but I think we can a little bit be proud what we have succeeded in. We have now our online lectures on a nearly bi-weekly basis. When I remember when we started it, we were not even sure if we would be able to do it on a monthly basis. In this, let's say, period, Corona period, we were able to organize 10 lectures and 4 online workshops. All these slides are available online, and all the talks and panel discussions are available at our YouTube channel, so you can have a look there. There we also included our soundtracks, since we finish all our discussions and panels with some short piece of music. I think we created a rich source of knowledge, and everything is accessible via our website. So you can go to the website and find all the material produced in this 1.5 years there. We started with some volunteer at the beginning, but at very high level, but we were volunteers. And now we have a program committee of nearly 25 international renowned academics working together and doing all this work. And we are also continuing in future. So the program committee, we are working we have 2 sub-working groups. One is working on a publication project on perspective on digital humanism, where we, up to now, I think we have collected 40 contributions to the book. And we work on an interdisciplinary digital humanism master curriculum. This is starting now, and I think we can produce some promising results. I think we succeeded in creating an international knowledge hub, not with a lot of money, but with quite a commitment. And we will continue, I'm sure we'll continue, because at the end, it's about our future as a society in a digital world. And I think there we have to act, not only to discuss, but also to act. I want to take this opportunity at the beginning to thank all those who contributed. These are the colleagues, international and nationals, from academia, from public and private institutions, from civil society, NGOs. All those who participated at our lectures or workshops. I have to say nearly all of them immediately accepted our invitations. We have nearly no rejections. I would like to thank the sponsors for their support, and also the small group at TU Wien, motivated group. I really want to stress that they are working on a voluntary basis, so they are not paid for that. This is organization. Now we have the talk of Sunimal, and then the response by Christiane, and then discussion moderated by Erich. At the end, we have again a piece of music selected by Peter Knees. I would like to stress that this time he was supported by Stefanie Bogovic, who at the end selected the piece. You will be surprised. I would like to introduce now Erich before handing over. Erich is the CEO of eutema. He's really an international renowned expert in the field of research, innovation strategy, and funding strategy. And he has more than 2 decades of experience in this field. He works also scientifically in AI. He's initially coming from AI, in research politics and innovation research, and also philosophy. He published more than 70 papers, and he also was a guest researcher at MIT. He's one of the few persons I know who has 2 PhDs. I know several who have more than 1 PhD, but one of the few who has a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in informatics. This is also what he studied at his master level here at TU Vienna. And he has a MBA in general management. So he has a academic degree also in general management. I do not assume that this was maybe the hardest achievement. And what is also important for us, he is a gifted piano player. He already participated twice at the end of our online discussion. Erich, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannes. And of course, I have to correct you on one thing. I'm not gifted as a piano player. It's actually only hard work. But anyway, thanks for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to focus on this topic of free speech and freedom of expression in the digital public sphere. And it's a particular pleasure to do this with Sunimal Mendis, or Suni for short, who I only got to know a few months ago over the course of a research sprint that was organized by the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, in which we were involved together, and which of course was the reason for inviting Suni to present some of our results and some of her own results. Suni is an assistant professor in intellectual property law at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society of the Tilburg University in the Netherlands. She holds a PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich. And she was also a fellow, as I said, of this 2020 research sprint on AI and platform governance. Her research explores, I would say, issues at the interface of intellectual property law, the digital economy, and digital culture, and it focuses very much on the need to calibrate current legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks in order to render, among other things, IP law a more effective tool for optimizing social and economic value creation within the new digital environment. And I think I'm particularly looking forward to also hearing from you, Suni, some, let's say, recommendations on what to do, and not just criticism, of course, but criticism is a good thing. And because we think it's a good thing, we have invited Professor Christiane Wendehorst to act as a respondent today. Christiane, following several positions in Germany, has been professor of civil law at the University of Vienna since 2008. Amongst many other functions, she is a founding member and president of the European Law Institute. She chairs the Academic Council of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and co-heads the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law. Yes, that exists. And until recently, she co-chaired the Data Ethics Commission of the German federal government. I think it's a role where perhaps many people will also have learned about Christiane's work. And she's also very active at the European and international levels, as she leads a European part of the transatlantic project Principles for a Data Economy, a very timely topic. And she's an EU delegate to the Global Partnership of AI. Now, Suni will talk for approximately 30 minutes or so, and then we'll ask Christiane to reply from, I guess, her broad background. And I would point out, maybe this is our first legal event, not suggesting that the others were illegal, but it's the first one where we actually focus nearly entirely on legal aspects. Certainly a very important topic. Suni, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Erich, for that nice introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, and special thanks to Professor Wendehorst for agreeing to be the respondent for this presentation. I will just share my screen now. Is that clear? Everybody can see the first slide, right? Okay, great. So, yes, the topic today is freedom of expression in the digital public sphere, preserving robust public discourse in the age of algorithmic content moderation. So, of course, this issue of content moderation, its impact on fundamental freedoms, particularly the freedom of expression, this is a hot topic since several years now. Here you see a photograph of some of the protests. I think this one is from Portugal, that were ignited by the introduction of the copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive in 2020 actually. And of course, this raised concerns with regard to its impact in pushing platforms to adopt more automated filtering systems. And of course, platforms have also been conscious of the criticism and the public backlash. So there have been attempts at voluntary efforts to show that platforms are also committed to preserving freedom of expression. For instance, the Facebook Oversight Board, which is supposed to function as an external independent body to oversee the content moderation system employed by Facebook, particularly with regard to ensuring the protection of the freedom of expression. And of course, the latest topic in the discussion is the proposal for the introduction of the Digital Services Act regulation in the EU. The proposal was finally published at the end of last year, towards the end of December, and it tries to sort of overhaul and make the intermediary liability framework in the EU more relevant to the digital environment, particularly to the digital single market. So the presentation today is based on a policy brief that was developed within the framework of the research sprint on AI and content moderation, which Erich mentioned in his introduction. This policy brief was co-authored by 6 researchers, myself and Erich included, and we came from lots of different disciplines. From political science, sociology, copyright law, fundamental rights, scholarship. This has been published. Again, it was published at the beginning of December. So before we got our hands on the actual DSA proposal. So the solutions we put forward in this policy review predates that proposal, but it's interesting to see that there are some links. And at the moment, we are involved in further developing the research that we initially started in the research sprint. So the presentation today is, in that sense, very much a work in progress. And it's a great opportunity for me because what I'll be doing is presenting our normative stance, our key arguments, the initial solutions that we have formulated, and try to bounce some ideas off you. And I'm really looking forward to the response by Professor Wendehorst as well as the discussion. So without further ado, this is my structure. I will first be introducing this concept of the digital public sphere and why we think that social media platforms that are open to the public constitute a component of this digital public sphere. And I will try to exemplify why the freedom of expression is one of the core requirements for ensuring that the public discourse taking place in this digital public sphere is robust and healthy. I will then outline the potency of content moderation in directing and influencing the, sorry, I skipped one, in directing and influencing public discourse in the digital public sphere, and explore the risks, or I should say the increased risks posed by algorithmic content moderation systems for the protection of the freedom of expression. Finally, I will present some of the strategies that we developed within the research sprint and which were published in our policy brief and also try to compare it with some of the mechanisms and principles that have been introduced in the proposed Digital Services Act, or DSA. So, why do we claim that online social media platforms that are open to the public form a key component of the digital public sphere? So this concept of the digital public sphere, of course, flows from Habermas's notion of the public sphere, which he conceived as a space where individuals gather to engage in open discussion of common public affairs. And this discussion is aimed towards the shaping of free public opinion. So the public sphere is, in fact, an open forum for dialogue, debate, deliberation, which assumes that this is a sphere that is first accessible to all persons, and it's a sphere within which all persons have the freedom and autonomy to put forward their views, to exchange, to build up on each other's opinions, and then to kind of reach some sort of this ideal, rationally formed public opinion. So the digital public sphere is this public sphere which takes place in the digital environment. And Schaefer provides this sort of definition of the digital public sphere as a communicative sphere provided or supported by online or social media, such as websites, social networking sites, web blogs, etc. And where participation is open and freely available to everybody who is interested, where matters of common concern can be discussed, and where proceedings are visible to all. So given the openness of online social media platforms to the public, the high numbers of users that they attract, for example, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, you have this huge global community of users, and of course its influence on contemporary social, political, and public discourse. We believe that it is correct to define these social media platforms as a component of the digital public sphere. So although these platforms are typically subject to private ownership by corporate entities, they do have a very important public function, which cannot be ignored. And quite often, the role of these platforms as part of the economic infrastructure is acknowledged and highlighted. However, it is less commonly acknowledged that it also has a very important role as a shared social and informational infrastructure that is open for public use. As I said, online social media platforms fulfill the core criteria of an infrastructural resource because they are open to any member of the public who agrees to abide by generally applicable terms of service or community guidelines. There's a word missing there. So in that sense, it is, and the consumption is non-rivalrous. Many people can use it at the same time without depleting it as a resource. And also they provide the key infrastructure and the tools to enable interaction, discourse, information exchange by a geographically dispersed public. So in that sense, they serve as a co-input resource for downstream activity and the provision of many types of services to the public. So what we argue is that the governance of these social media platforms then need to reflect this public-private partnership element and aim towards balancing the private interests held by the owners of these platforms, for example, profit maximization, furtherance of their individual corporate agendas, minimizing the liability they incur, by kind of contravening on certain laws, with the public interests of preserving fundamental rights and freedoms, protecting individual and public security, and what we are going to focus on in this presentation, fostering and sustaining robust public discourse. So what do I mean by robust public discourse in this sense? So it's very difficult to really find a definition of what is robust public discourse. But again, we get an indication from Dahlgren, who in explaining the notion, Habermas's notion of a public sphere, sort of describes it as a space that allows for rational, critical citizen discourse that is autonomous from state and corporate power, which enables privately oriented individuals to become publicly oriented citizens, and for public opinion to develop that can rationally guide democratic decision making. So some core values can be sort of extracted from this definition. For instance, autonomy and self-determination, which means that the individuals should have some moral independence from state, corporate, or any other sort of hierarchical power to reflect, critique, deliberate, and form opinions free of manipulation or suppression. Pluralism, which means there should be equal opportunity to participate in public discourse. It should not be possible for the owners of the platform to sort of block people from participating in the discourse at their discretion. There should be a representation of diverse viewpoints. All kinds of ideas should be capable of being expressed in this space. And of course, you cannot really have robust discourse, in my opinion, unless there's creative freedom, because discourse also requires intellectual experimentation, critique, creative thought. And when you look at all these core values, you see that these are the values that the freedom of expression actually targets at preserving as well. So this is why we are arguing that the freedom of expression is actually the baseline requirement in order to preserve robust public discourse on online platforms. Of course, it's not a magic bullet. The preservation of robust public discourse requires many other steps, for example, better cooperation between the stakeholders involved, especially the users, better transparency mechanisms. But the freedom of expression is really the core prerequisite, which needs to be protected if we are to ensure that we can use these online social media platforms as spaces that are capable of really contributing to the digital public sphere. So in line with states' positive obligation to protect the freedom of expression, we argue that states have a duty to ensure protection of freedom of expression by platforms, especially in content moderation. So content moderation, of course, there is Grimmelman's very well-known definition of it being a process by which platforms shape community participation, prevent abuse, ensure compliance. And platforms are able to engage in this moderation process by virtue of their ownership of the digital space in which the public interacts. And platforms determine what is permitted content in accordance with the law that is applicable to the platform. So usually the law of the country in which the platform is located, or and as well as terms of service that are determined at the discretion of the platform owner or administrator. So content moderation seeks to control what is posted or what is expressed in the digital sphere, in the online space, by means of making decisions about what can be, what is seen, heard, or said by users. And in that sense, it has both an enabling and a restricting function. So the enabling function refers to its ability to shape behavior and perceptions, which means control what is seen, heard, and said online. And this can have a norm-setting effect by creating a sense in the users as to what is acceptable and unacceptable discourse. Secondly, content moderation can also direct user attention to certain types of content over others. particularly through search rankings, or the way in which the visibility of content is adjusted. So this is a much more indirect way of shaping behavior and perceptions, because content moderation is able to nudge users towards seeing certain types of information more than others. Then the restriction function, which is inhibiting behavior or access. So the removal or blocking of illegal or harmful content, which is aimed towards minimizing the negative effects of harmful discourse, means that certain types of content are removed from the platform and are blocked from being seen by the public. Similarly, the blocking or suspension of user accounts, which means that the platform has the ability to deny certain people the access to participate in the public discourse. So what are the key implications of content moderation for the preservation of the freedom of expression? Firstly, it means that a private entity is able to make a decision concerning an individual's capacity to access and participate in the public discourse taking over the platform. And of course, these systems are not perfect, and inaccuracies and inefficiencies in the system can result in the wrongful suppression of even lawful forms of speech. And we see why algorithmic content moderation can actually make this worse. In addition, as mentioned before, content moderation systems can sort of block content, even if that content is permitted by the law of the land, by reason that it is not compliant with the terms of service. So privately determined terms of service act as an additional layer of speech regulation. And this results in the privatization of public discourse regulation. And of course, different platforms have different norms and standards as to what is permitted and not permitted. And this can also create uncertainty and undermine confidence in the accepted values of social discourse on the digital public sphere. And at the moment, if you look at the regulatory framework in the EU, there are several challenges with regards to preserving the freedom of expression on online platforms. Firstly, platforms being part of the private sphere are not required to positively engage in the protection of freedom of expression. So no freedom of expression duties are explicitly incumbent on them. Of course, there are exceptions, but these exceptions are not really well developed. So at the moment, there are no positive legal obligations on platforms to protect freedom of expression. Then the regulatory effort approach adopts a very hands-off approach with a strong preference for self-regulation by platforms, which means that platforms have a wide discretion to decide how the content moderation systems are designed and implemented, subject to minimal state regulation and oversight, which, as I will explain, becomes a big problem. And of course, there are absence of incentives to really foster freedom of expression, because there are enforceable obligations to make sure that illegal content is removed, but there are no such obligations to ensure that legal content is allowed to remain on the platform. So there are no must-carry obligations, as we say. So we already see that content moderation can have a negative impact on the freedom of expression, but how does the proliferation of algorithmic content moderation systems kind of impact on this situation? So algorithmic content moderation systems, of course, are automated systems. Their functionality is designed by the functionality is determined by the design of the algorithm, and as well as the input data on which the algorithm has been trained. So the advent of algorithmic content moderation, or ACMS, it signifies an additional layer to the governance framework. And this layer is determined by computer code. So as Lawrence Lessig says, code becomes law, and code starts to regulate our behavior and our speech. So within the research sprint, we carried out case studies of the use of ACMS by 4 social media platforms, and the following limitations were revealed. First, algorithmic content moderation systems are context blind. They have a low capacity for comprehending nuances, contextual variations, cultural connotations in human speech, and the consequence is that there's a high possibility for lawful speech, such as parody, satire, quotations, to be removed by these systems. For example, there was this example of a parody of a racist remark that was published by a German magazine, which would normally be permitted under freedom of expression, being flagged and deleted by the algorithmic moderation system of Twitter. Secondly, there's a high level of language dependency, and the accuracy of the system improves with the volume of the training data sets, which means there's a higher risk of inaccuracy for content written in minority languages, for which a smaller amount of training data sets are available. So this means that people conversing in minority languages can be prejudiced by the use of ACMS. Finally, they are also designed to process conventional types of files, such as text or video, which means they have a low capacity for processing certain types of content, such as memes and GIFs. And this leads to an asymmetry in the way these different types of content are moderated, and negative implications for emerging creative forms of expression. The case studies also pointed to a higher risk of inaccurate decision-making, because there was a positive correlation between the increased use of ACMS during the past several months by YouTube and the rate of reinstatements of content that has been wrongfully taken down or removed from the YouTube platform. And this is despite the fact that the number of appeals has remained relatively constant. So this leads us to the hypothesis that the increased use of ACMS without substantial human oversight can in fact result in higher levels of wrongful removal and disabling of legitimate content. So to summarize, what are the implications of the proliferation of ACMS for the freedom of expression? The risk of a greater level of inaccuracy, false positives, false negatives, so enhanced risk of suppressing controversial and creative but lawful speech, less transparency, there's lack of information or insight into how the algorithm actually functions, how it draws correlations and makes decisions, the black box of artificial intelligence. And then there's a greater risk of censorship. For example, ACMS provides the possibility for ex-ante screening, which means that content is screened at the moment it's uploaded. And if that content is considered to be illegal by the system, it can block that content from actually being posted on the platform. So as Bolkin says, this leads us to this risk of digital prior restraint. So what are really the causes for the proliferation of ACMS? Firstly, of course, the increase in the volume of content shared on these websites or platforms and the number of users. It becomes very difficult to perform content moderation purely using human moderators, and a certain level of automation absolutely becomes necessary. On the other hand, automated systems are widely available. They can prove to be faster, more efficient in certain ways than human moderators, and sometimes more effective. Then we have the corona effect, where in the past months, since the start of the pandemic, a lot of platforms were not able to actually engage in content moderation with human moderators because they were not able to come to their workplace. It was difficult for these moderators to work from home, many different reasons. So it's possible that maybe one day when the pandemic is over, actually the ACMS becomes the new normal because so many platforms have switched to it. Finally, and something that I'm particularly interested in coming from my legal background, is the stringent regulatory measures that impose a higher degree of liability on platforms for hosting illegal and harmful content. And this imposes greater pressure on the platforms to monitor and filter the content shared on their platforms. So the traditional framework in the EU, and of course also in the US and even China, was the negligence-based approach to liability, where liability is imputed on the platform owner or the intermediary service provider based on actual knowledge and awareness. Also, there was no general obligation to monitor or to actively seek facts or circumstances indicating illegal activity. However, during the past years, there has been a global shift towards increasing the liability of platforms for illegal content hosted on them. The infamous Article 17 of the EU Copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive changed the liability of platform owners for copyright infringing content from being secondary liability to direct liability on the basis that these platforms actually perform an act of communication to the public by hosting the infringing content. Other stringent obligations, not only take down, but the stay down requirement to ensure stay down in Article 17. The NetzDG law in Germany requires that manifestly unlawful content has to be blocked or removed within a 24-hour time period. And finally, the imposition of stiff monetary penalties, for example, Section 4 of the NetzDG law. So, of course, when platforms perform a cost-benefit analysis, it's much more beneficial for them to opt to sort of engage in overregulation and to remove or block any kind of questionable content, rather than to take the risk of incurring liability. And this increases the risks of collateral censorship.
Sorry, Suni, I hate to interrupt you, but we need to conclude, like okay, 3 minutes warning. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Okay, I'm in my last slides. So I would now present some of the strategies for minimizing that we came up with during the research sprint. And what we did was to identify two main gaps that were preventing the protection of the freedom of expression on online platforms. Firstly, the information gap, which refers to the inadequacy of the legal obligations on platforms to provide information on how ACMS are designed and implemented. And also there is insufficient granularity and standardization on the extent and type of information that is provided through voluntary transparency reports. So this creates sort of a gap in the amount of information available to regulators. Secondly, the accountability gap, which means that there is inadequacy of enforceable legal obligations to provide complaints and redress mechanisms. There is inadequacy of regulatory supervision, and there's also information asymmetry, which means that platforms have insufficient capacity to safeguard freedom of expression. For instance, they are not really sure about their duties and obligations, and the moderators are not really able to correctly determine issues related to the freedom of expression. So I will just take you through our main proposals. The first was to ensure effective public supervision of ACMS by establishing a public authority or ombudsman in each member state who will be able to supervise, assess the safeguarding of FOE by platforms, provide guidance and advice to platforms on fulfilling statutory duties, and will also have a reviewing function, as I will come to later. So the DSA in Article 38 also envisions a similar public authority, the digital service coordinators. However, their task is quite different to what we envision the Ombudsman would fulfill, because it's sort of a more macro level investigation into possible infringements of the DSA provision, as opposed to supervision or assessment of the ACMS systems or FOE. So to close the accountability gap, we proposed that enforceable statutory obligations be imposed on all platforms to establish an effective complaints and redress mechanism. and that decisions provided under this effective complaints and redress mechanism should also be capable of being appealed, firstly to the Ombudsman, and if a party is not satisfied with the decision given by the Ombudsman, there should be a final appeal to the appropriate national or regional court. Comparison with the DSA, yes, there is an obligation to establish an internal complaints and handling mechanisms. It's very good. A good aspect is that it requires this, that the complaints handling mechanism should not be fully automated. There's a need to involve humans. However, there are no provisions to ensure that due process is upheld. For example, the rights of parties to be heard is not specifically mentioned due to two reasons, similarly not. But they also do provide for an appeal from the decisions given by this mechanism, which is a positive aspect. Closing the information gap, we envisaged that platforms should have a duty to submit information to the Ombudsman, for example, quarterly reports on the complaints and redress mechanism, annual fundamental rights impact assessments, so that the Ombudsman can supervise and ensure that freedom of expression is preserved to an adequate extent. Comparison with DSA, I think this is one of the aspects in which the DSA really shines, because they have very detailed obligations to provide information to the public, transparency reporting, annual reportings on how content moderation was actually implemented, and also an obligation for risk assessment that is, of course, only applicable to very large platforms. Some key principles of the DSA, what is really important is that this regulation for the first time recognizes the importance of fundamental rights, and that all provisions should be interpreted and applied in accordance with those fundamental rights. So this is a very, very strong step by the EU lawmakers. And although Article 17 will still remain a lex specialis, there is a possible impact that Article 17 could also be interpreted within the sort of, framework that is established by the DSA in respecting and upholding fundamental rights. A few good provisions of the DSA, so safe harbor preserved, liability based on actual knowledge, the Good Samaritan principle is introduced. We can go into this more in the discussion. There is no general monitoring obligation. Illegal content is very clearly defined. And also, finally, Article 12.2 requires platforms to act in a diligent, objective, and proportionate manner in engaging in CM with due regard to rights and legitimate interests of all parties involved, including the applicable fundamental rights. So that is a very, very positive aspect. So I look forward to Professor Wendehorst's response. I'm sorry for taking so much time, but you got me on my hobby horse, so to speak. But yes, looking forward to all your comments.
Thank you, Suni, and thanks for, this feels like a complete course on the topic. But anyway, thank you very much for this. And without further ado, I ask Christiane to respond to what you just said, Suni.
Thank you so much, Erich, for inviting me, and thank you above all to Sunimal for this great talk. In essence, I have to agree with all the points you were making, or let's say most of the points. So I think you were absolutely right in referring to this notion of a public digital sphere, or digital public sphere rather. I also think you were absolutely right in stressing that significance of freedom of information and content moderation, and pointing out that information gap and that accountability gap which we are seeing out there with those platforms. And I largely agree also with the range of different measures you proposed. And we see that the DSA has now, maybe not, maybe there was no causal relationship, but anyway, you kind of reached very similar conclusions here and there as the DSA did. However, as you pointed out quite rightly, there are also some significant differences. Now, before I knew that you would be going through all your proposals and compare them with the DSA, I did so clandestinely. So I had your policy brief as a kind of background information, and I clandestinely went through the list and ticked off all the boxes, so to say, to check what is in the DSA and what is not in the DSA. So, to a large extent, I come to similar conclusions as you did. However, there are some points which I find in the DSA that I would be very interested to hear your opinion on. Let me just mention 2 points which I find are very, very important points, and we might wish to discuss that later on. This is trusted flaggers, the role of trusted flaggers, and the role of vetted researchers. I think these are 2 innovative mechanisms we might wish to address in our discussion. Then I saw on one of your slides that you criticized the DSA for excluding micro and small platforms from some of the provisions. Now, I know this is a very controversial point. I take it, at least I understood you as saying that you would have loved to see these provisions apply across the board. That's how I understood you, and that's how I understand your policy brief. I have to say that I'm a little bit of a different opinion there, because we have to realize that all this regulation which we've been seeing over the past decades have had the effect of benefiting the big players and of basically preventing smaller platforms and smaller players from entering the market. So we can, of course, discuss whether the thresholds are appropriate. I mean, if we see what is a small enterprise, it's defined as fewer than 50 heads of staff and less than 10 million euro of annual turnover, and micro is of course still fewer. So we can discuss the threshold, but on balance, I believe that this approach of having asymmetric regulation is a good approach, and I think we should go further down that road. Now, I see you also criticized that there's no due process. I realize and I agree with you that this is a little bit a weak point, but if you look at Article 17 of the DSA, I think there is a good deal of due process requirements in there. So maybe just 1 or 2 further points. I saw on one of your slides, but that was very, very quickly. So you went through that very, very quickly, that you were kind of arguing in favor of damages or compensation. And I was wondering, I think there was something like where necessary. And I was wondering whether that is really well thought through. I mean, of course, the where necessary is in need of interpretation. So when is it necessary? And we all agree that there are some cases where it is necessary to have compensation and damages. But I would be very reluctant to say that every kind of removal that was unjustified should trigger a claim for damages. And the reason why I'm stressing is that we are seeing these claims also in other places. We see it in the Parliament proposal for AI liability. There too, there is a claim for strict liability for any kind of immaterial harm that's been caused by AI. And I think actually that's going a little bit too far. And that leads me to my last point. which is more of a question. So I'm wondering, is there maybe a need to differentiate between different types of content moderation? There is that kind of good faith content moderation, platforms really grappling with a very, very difficult phenomenon, trying to do their best. It's almost a mission impossible to achieve it. They're engaging in that business in good faith. And then there is that other type of content moderation, the type of content moderation we absolutely don't want to see because it has discriminatory effects in terms of a language, ethnic origin, because it's anti-pluralistic, because it's driven by economic interests while pretending to be pluralistic and for the freedom of speech. And I'm really wondering whether it's still possible for our regulation to be that neutral and only say, well, it's about transparency and everything, but we're never going to say the type of practices we don't like. And I'd like to compare this with a parallel proposal also tabled by the Commission on the same day, the digital markets proposal. And there we find in Articles 5 and 6 exactly that unfair algorithmic practices approach I've always been arguing for. So we see that there's at least an attempt to spell out quite clearly the kind of practices we don't want to see. And just to close with the question whether that would maybe also something we need when it comes to algorithmic content moderation. Thank you very much. But again, it was a great talk, a great policy brief, great proposals, and I really like the work you did.
Thank you so much, Christiane. Before giving Suni the floor again, there have been a few questions in the chat, but I would like to give the opportunity to our colleagues to raise questions. Anybody? I'm trying to monitor like 5 different screens here. But if not, maybe Suni, do you want to reply to that?
Yes, very briefly, the final point.
Erich?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Could I come in?
Absolutely, go ahead.
No.
We cannot hear you now. Oh, let's have Sunis reply and then we come back to you. Suni.
Sure, I'll be quick. I mean, I would really like to reply quickly to the last point that Christiane raised, which I think is completely spot on. The fact that we need to differentiate between different types of content in governing content moderation systems. So, for instance, with regards to things like child sexual exploitation, I think, leaving the risks of incurred in leaving it to ACMS would be much less. Firstly, because it would be easier for an ACMS system to spot the actual unlawful content. I mean, there's much less nuance, for instance, I mean, in distinguishing between legal and illegal content where child sexual exploitation is involved. But with regards to most of the content, which would be normal discourse, is something hate speech or not, is something copyright infringing or not. I think there is really a need to be cautious in adopting automated content moderation systems, which is why it's become such an urgent topic. But yes, I completely agree with that observation. Can I go on, or should I would like to hear from some other.
Sorry, I wanted to raise...
Helga wants to ask a question. Helga, please.
I wanted to come back to your proposal of having an ombudsman. Now, to have such an institution institutionalized is a, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Because I've been off,
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, that was a yes, and now it's a no.
Sorry,
But we can still hear you. We can still, we don't see you, but we hear you. Go ahead, Helga. Let's wait for Helga to come back, maybe. And Suni, maybe you can, we can take some of the some of the questions in the chat. There has been one, of course, about the deplatforming of Trump. I think this is why the topic has been really hot in the last few weeks and months. And suddenly everybody seemed to have realized the power of platforms, and it's a private power. So what do you think about this? Because actually, I don't think you mentioned once the option of the platforms, but what would you say to this?
I think in Trump's case, it's quite clear. I mean, I'm not a US lawyer, but his tweet, if you read it, that there is an incitement to violence, and it's very clearly stated, I mean, in the First Amendment sort of jurisprudence, that incitement to violence is not covered under freedom of expression. And in addition, it could also be a felony under US law. So I think in that sort of instances, it's quite clear cut, especially given his sort of position as the the president of the USA. So for me, this is not an instance where there is any balancing of interests or the need to appreciate nuance or context, because when you read his tweet, it becomes quite clear that this is something patently illegal, and I think Twitter was absolutely justified in removing it forthwith.
I think we have Helga back.
Yes,
Helga.
Sorry. I wanted to ask about the Ombudsman, because there are not many legal systems which know the institution of Ombudsman. So it has been rather, a minor addition, a very important but minor addition. So how do you think this could become a feasible institution? And what would be necessary in terms of a national legal structure to create such an institution?
So yes, well, we use the term ombudsman, but what we are really talking about is a competent authority here who would sort of both oversee the platforms and function as a link between the platforms and the regulatory authorities. So I am not really still clear about the kind of regulatory structure within which such a position could be created, but I also don't think that it is something completely unprecedented. And it's interesting that the DSA proposal also envisions the establishment of this, I think it's the Digital Services Coordinator. There will be one for each member state. He will be registered with the member states' regulatory authorities and would have the power to investigate possible infringements of the DSA. So sort of the Ombudsman, what we're looking at is kind of similar to the competition law authorities of each country. Of course, their task would be a bit more specific, because within our proposal, we are only looking at an ombudsman who will be investigating violations of freedom of expression. But I think it would be possible, and it would be a good idea to have such a figure who would be able to sort of ensure the protection of all fundamental rights, because that is something we are really lacking. And if we want to maintain the legitimacy of these platforms as a safe space for discourse in the future, such an intervention is going to be necessary.
Christiane, please.
Thank you so much. I would also like to comment on the Trump question. I actually agree that this is a clear-cut case albeit not a clear-cut case for algorithmic content moderation. I'm not sure, you know, if you just take the text of his tweets, that this should have necessarily been something that's kind of filtered out ab initio. If somebody, you know, a person on the street makes that tweet, but you have to see it in its context. And it's him being the president of the US, it's a number of followers, but above all, it is that we have seen what kind of absolutely disastrous effect it has. So it's also kind of the effect which we have seen. And so I think that was clearly not a decision, by the way, taken by an algorithm. So I bet there was a large number of human beings sitting at a table and debating whether they take that step or not. And so I think it was a right decision, but a bad example, a bad illustration for algorithmic content moderation.
Which brings us to 2 points mentioned in the chat. So one is by Alison Stanger about the Communications Decency Act, which is kind of unique to the US in protecting internet speech, and some have called for its repeal, since speech that could be declared incitement to violence by the First Amendment is protected in the digital space. So do you think Americans should repeal this act to reduce polarization generated by social media that spills over into European digital space? I don't know, who would like to answer that? Suni or Christiane?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question to tell the US to kind of repeal that statute, knowing also the importance of First Amendment in the US actually. So I'm not sure, you know, repealing this act would absolutely be the answer to the problem. I think we should approach all this problem in a we should not have just one factor, you know, we should approach it in a very cautious way with a lot of different mechanisms. And I think the kind of mechanisms which you have put forward in your paper and which are somehow a little bit softer are by and large a good approach. Even though I admit that as a European, of course, some elements in US law don't seem very convincing to me, but I'm not sure, you know, a claim to repeal it is absolutely necessary.
The other comment in the chat, which I would still like to mention, although we are running out of time, is James Larusse's, of course, about automated content moderation, who seems to share my own skepticism about the technology, because, I mean, it's AI, and actually what we are seeing today is extremely simple. Most of it is just keyword based. And I want to combine it with this issue of what's illegal, and I think where the limits of freedom of expression are rather clear, to what is often mentioned, especially when you talk to policymakers, which is harmful content, which is very, very ill-defined. And then I often make the case that we need harmful speech, because otherwise we don't need freedom of expression at all. Because if no one's harmed, we don't need this part of the regulation. Maybe Suni or Christiane, you want to take
I mean,
this?
I would just like to point out that is one of the positive aspects of the DSA, because they actually define what is illegal, and they define it in terms of what is illegal under either under national law or under the law, the EU law. So there's a very clear-cut definition now. The only thing is that platforms are still able to determine their own terms of service, which means that, of course, other types of content that are not per se illegal will be caught within this sort of secondary category of harmful. But still, it's also not possible to prevent that, because these also have the character of private spaces, and one way in which this can be kind of balanced is to have more transparency as to what is allowed and what is not, and to make sure that the terms of service are framed in very clear ways.
Yeah. I don't know, Christiane, would you like to add on to this?
Yes, I think that is, in fact, I mean, the harmful content is the much more difficult part of it, because lying, for example, as such, is not illegal. So it's not illegal to say, you know, vaccination is bad for your health and whatever, if you believe that this is the case. And yet we know the kind of detrimental effect this can have if like people, you know, copy this and hear this all the time. And this is indeed one of the points where I would have liked to see more. I think one of the problems we see with this harmful content is that people are like caught in those filter bubbles and echo chambers, and then get confronted with this kind of alternative reality, and they live in an alternative world, and then, you know, they believe all sorts of things which people around no longer believe. And that is, for me, the new dimension that comes with those platforms. When we were relying still on traditional media, things were in some respects much worse. So there was much less freedom of expression in former times before we had these digital public places and spheres. But we were still like walking past a newsstand. We saw newspapers, we saw what other people are reading. And nowadays we have a situation where a large part of the population only gets their view of the world from out of one source. And that source is then kind of repeating and repeating that really harmful stuff. And there I would have loved to see a little bit more, I have to say. I mean, it's indirectly included in those risk assessment provisions, like you have to conduct a fundamental rights risk assessment, you have to assess the wider impact of your policies, and so on and so forth. But there I would really have liked to see a little bit more. I agree, it's really difficult, but I think you could be a little bit more courageous and ambitious there.
Thank you so much. I think I'd like to leave it here. As you can see, there is still more questions in the chat and comments as well. And obviously, I think this is really the beginning of the discussion. I mean, despite the fact that we now have new EU regulations and there are other areas in the world where people have been thinking about this, we have certainly not reached the end in this discussion. I should also say, maybe from an engineering side, also in, you know, technologically, there is still a lot to do and a lot that can be done. And Suni, I would like to thank you again, especially in pointing out proposals, what to do or what could be done, and comparing it, as you both have done, Christiane and Suni, to what the EU has just proposed. So thanks for that. And I hope to come back to the topic in later this year or maybe next year with some updates on the developments, which should be really interesting. And with this, I hand back to, I'm not sure, Hannes or Peter.
If you want, I can take it from here right away.
Yeah, Peter, you take it.
Sure. Let me quickly share the screen. So we're getting to the final notes for today, and today's final notes. As already mentioned in the beginning, there were a suggestion made by Stefanie Vogovic once more, and they are a perfect fit, actually. It's the track Freedom of Speech by Ice-T, and actually this track takes us back more than 30 years to 1989, and actually provides a bit of that historic perspective of what the discussion was in all those pre-social media times, or maybe some of the discussion was at least. So that's quite interesting from perspective, of course, of a musical artist, and so on. But basically the track departs from the censorship of music and the controversy at the time about these parental advisory stickers. For those of you who remember that controversy, but back then that was a big thing, and still nobody cares these days anymore about it actually. But that is a warning also from my side about the explicit lyrics of this track. Also, yeah, the lyrics are definitely the centerpiece of this thing. But besides all the profanity that prove the point of freedom of speech in this track, it's interesting to hear even accusations of, let's say, witch hunt and so on, which sound very familiar these days. However, coming from another direction. I will play the full piece over 4 minutes now. Feel free to drop out if you don't approve of the music or the content or whatever. It's the last part of today's program, and there's only one thing left, and that's the announcement of our next lecture on February 23rd, which is a panel on data colonialism and the European response. The panelists are the member of the European Parliament, Pilar del Castillo, Professor Locke Morel from, again, Tilburg University, and from the European Commission, Acting Director and Head of the Data Policy and Innovation Unit, Ivo Wollmann. And George Mitakidis is going to moderate this panel. So now for some old school hip hop, and goodbye.